Hello, welcome everyone to this Devex conference call on global health communications in the social media era. My name is Corinne Muhumaza, and I am the Associate Director of Communications here at Devex. Thank you all for joining from all over the world on this Friday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are right now. I'm joining from the Devex office here in Washington, D.C. I'm excited to be speaking with our guest, Lippy Doshi, who is a global health and development communications expert who has worked with various global health organizations, including PATH, JPIGO, and Palladium. He is currently a public affairs advisor in the Bureau of Global Health at USAID and the co-chair of Social Media for Global Health, a community of over 1,000 professionals using social media to progress their global goals. Lippy is a wealth of knowledge, so I'm excited to have her here joining me this morning. So before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping information. We'll be taking questions, so please submit them in the Q&A widget throughout the call. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can submit them there so our technical team can assist you. So let's get started. Welcome, Lippy.
Hi, Corinne. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, we're excited to be chatting with you. So next week is a big week for health, with global health professionals and with development professionals all convening in Geneva for the 72nd World Health Assembly. So global health peers around the world will certainly be busy, to say the least. So Lippy, you've been doing global health communications for the last decade. What can you tell us about the current global health communications landscape? How have you seen the rise of social media and digital really disrupt the global health communication space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks again to Devex for having me today. Just looking back at my career, when I first got into global health communications, specifically social media, there was very clear aversion to using social media. And I think that's because global health roots are in science and evidence-based research, and the core of our communications has always been human interest pieces. So organizations are uncomfortable with simplifying content or exposing the vulnerable to fit social media platforms, and they were uncomfortable with the uncertainty of how far content could go in the Twitterverse or on Facebook or whichever platform they were using. And then there was a huge shift in the industry to meet the growing use of personal and professional social media around the world. And I think that started in a few ways. First, Twitter became the easier blog. I'm sure you remember, Corinne, when the blog was the way to do everything and we needed to blog all the time. When Twitter started, I think it became I think when Twitter started, it became the option for research sharing, and particularly in academia, I think researchers and scientists found a voice for their research and their opinions online that was quick and easy to use. And I saw this in real time when I was at Hopkins. The leading experts who were risk-taking enough to have a personal Twitter account started to combine their professional work with their personal thoughts. And I remember in one of my classes, Dr. Orrin Levine, who is now at the Gates Foundation, set up a contest where students had to write a blog for his very popular Huffington Post blog about vaccine hesitancy, and then he would tweet it out. And at that time, this was so cutting edge. I still follow many of those professors, but it's just interesting to look at how things have changed since then. And then the other shift that happened, I think, is that well-resourced organizations, some of the really big NGOs, the big foundations, the donors, they had strong marketing teams who were ready to follow industry standards and invest in social media. And once they did that, they took a hard look at what was really available to share about global health. And I think that's when the World Observation Day that so many of us are familiar with and so many of our editorial calendars are full of, like World Malaria Day or World Immunization Week, World Health Day even. I think that's when those days exploded in the digital sense versus before being in-person events or offline moments. And then
yeah, absolutely.
I guess I want to say around 2012, 2013, social media really turned into an entirely new beast for a community. I think as an industry, we're slow to take on new ways of doing things, which is fine. But once we do, we fully invest and we take things to another level. And social media became the expected. It became really attractive in that it was low cost and high reaching and considered modern. And now we don't just have one Twitter chat a year, but maybe we have one every 2 weeks. Everything got hashtagged, everything got a day. The same people, our industry communicators and our industry influencers tuned into every single one of our digital events. And I'm saying that because I think today the saturation of global health on social media has become really high. Corinne, another thing you might remember are thunderclaps. I think
it got so thunderclaps.
Yeah, thunderclaps are a lot of fun. But I think they're a perfect example of how saturated global health social media became, because we had to create a whole new mechanism to cut through our own conversations. Thunderclaps were a way to get lots of people to copy paste the exact same content on their own Twitter account, so that a moment was kind of artificially created on social media for a specific topic. So I think most of the communicators listening on the call today will now see social media as the expected. If you're launching a report, holding a meeting, observing a day, maybe even just publishing a page on your website, you have to support it with a tweet. And we live in a world now where, the Director General of the WHO has an active and extremely well-followed Twitter account. So I think it's time to be strategic about how we use social media for global health. And I think about this a lot, especially as the co-chair of Social Media for Global Health, the working group. Are we really reaching new people, or are we talking to ourselves? And if we're just talking to ourselves, that's okay, but we should work on not pretending that we're talking to new people in some of our campaigns, and make a point of shifting our social media communications to address that we're talking to an informed audience, not a new one. And then when we want to bring in new audiences, we need to work on being innovative about how we're using our social media.
Yeah, that's really great, Libby. I think that just gives us kind of like a trajectory of how social has changed, just looking kind of like the up and down. And even if you I think about like even when Facebook Lives were a thing, I think I was mostly emailing or getting other social media communicators to kind of be tuning into those. And yeah, you make a really good point about who we're talking to and figuring out how to do that. So as communicators, I think one of the things that we often think about, or we have to prove, I think when social first came out, people were all about the viral moment. But now I think viral moments can happen at any time. So as communicators, we really constantly have to prove our impact or the impact of our work. But I think in global health comms, impact is really often oriented around long-term awareness campaigns or even behavior change, whereas social is really not about that. Social is about real-time engagement like retweets and shares and trending topics. How are global health communicators measuring impact and reach of their work? Are social media metrics even a good way to measure impact for the work that you do?
Yeah, great question. This is the reach versus resonance question. And I think one that I stay up at night thinking about all the time. So when social was new, those impression numbers or the number of people that could have seen your content meant quality and good quantity, because the social media universe was really different. But now it's everybody and anybody. So I don't think we're ever going to step away from reporting on total reach or impressions. Those numbers are what fuels social media, and frankly, without them, it's hard to make a case. It's hard to make the case for social media resources or hires at many of our under-resourced organizations. Just the fact that a qualified communicator can reach 1 million people with a few clicks is so key to justifying having social media staffing and social media strategies in our organizations. But you asked about if there's a better way to measure impact, and I would really ask social media communicators to think hard about how they're developing their campaigns and measuring their campaigns. What exactly are we doing, or what exactly are we accomplishing by reaching millions of Twitter users on World Polio Day, for example? It's really important to dig deep on the ultimate ask of those people. In my experience, I've worked on the marketing side of social media in this community, and I've spent many years on the advocacy side of social media in this community. And I think resources often sort of determine how we default on measuring social media. And we should strive to change that. On the marketing side, sometimes I had $1,000 per post on social. And when I was on the advocacy side, sometimes I had $0 for a year-long advocacy push. And in both cases, reach was important, but because of those extreme resources, the quality of the reach was way more important.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think that really brings a good kind of segue into like just talking about audiences, because within global health, you have so many audiences that you're trying to reach, whether it's journalists to talk about the work that you're doing, or even obviously like global health peers, like your peers in the space are also people that you're trying to reach. But yeah, just thinking about that, especially as like social media has really become a game where it's like a pay to play space, right? So can you just talk about a little bit about your experiences with just figuring out kind of making those decisions when you had $0 or you had $1,000? What kind of decisions were you having to make, and where were you actually like putting money?
Yeah, great question. So I actually think a lot of my thinking about how to use social media comes from my experience in the advocacy space, and I encourage others to check out some strong advocacy accounts and how they use social media. But by nature, advocacy, especially policy advocacy, tends to break down its goals to really specific asks, like change in a line of legislation or acknowledgement from a minister in some country, or buy-in from a specific group of people, like, pediatricians or faith-based organizations, whatever that group may be. So that same level of narrow audience targeting is used by the industry's best on social media, right? The retail industry. They have to be really specific about which consumer you're targeting, because only the consumer that ultimately buys matters. So I think we need to start sharing successes on social, doing that very narrow audience targeting, and encourage others to do the same. And when we do, we're going to start seeing innovation on how we use social, be it in content, campaign style, paid advertising, or even more simply differing content according to which platform you're using.
Yeah, no, I think that's all really great. I think also just thinking about if you look at some of these platforms that are kind of switching to more one-to-one engagement. So if you look at Facebook, and I think they're really going to be pushing Messenger within the next year. So it'll be interesting to see what global health organizations or even other people in the space do now that it won't be so much like a newsfeed won't matter as much. Just thinking about how we'll be communicating more one-to-one with people as well. I'd love to kind of segue into talking about influencers. I think influencers are definitely having a moment. I don't know if the bubble has popped yet. If you want to talk about oversaturation, that's definitely one place that's oversaturated. I think there's often hesitation within the development space to use influencers for various reasons. I think figuring out who to kind of partner with and who kind of aligns with your organizational values, I think is one part, perhaps part of the hesitation. But I want to get your thoughts on it. Do we need them? Why or why not? And how do you see them fitting into the global health communications ecosystem? So
I think, yes, we absolutely need to be tapping into influencers, and I don't think we do it enough. Global health is so interwoven with the highest levels of government, for example, so we often are brushing by influencers and never fully employing them in our social media campaigns. And I think there's a lot of different industries, I guess you could say, that we could take a look at and sort of follow. One is actually, I think we could really take a cue from the domestic health industry in the United States in particular. I think they do an amazing job of using influencers. And while we've tried to do this at the global level with mixed results, they've done, I think, a really good job and have seen a lot of success. Specifically, I was recently looking at the CDC's work in the HIV space in the United States and saw they worked with Karamo Brown from Queer Eye on a Fighting Stigma campaign. And I thought that was fantastic. Another thing that's coming up actually this weekend, so before the World Health Assembly, the WHO is hosting a celebratory 3K walk. It's called Walk the Talk. And part of that, Lady Gaga and her mother will be at the walk to talk about global mental health, an issue that we frankly don't hear about a lot. But I think it's great that they're kicking off that campaign, one, at a really important moment in global health, the WHA, and then also with an influencer and a very prominent organization. And influencers don't have to mean celebrities. I think it's understanding who has a voice in our community and strategically using it. You could use an influential youth voice as well. Another thing that's happening at WHA this weekend is the IFMSA youth delegation is having a pre-WHA conference, and they are tweeting up a storm right now. And I think so many of the youth advocates that are talking on Twitter right now could easily become future influencers for us. So to answer your question, yes, we should really try to be tapping into influencers. I mean, global health is well-being of everyone is an easy topic to get behind, something that we know people of influence will be happy to participate in. I think it's something that we just haven't done enough. One more thing, and then I'll turn it back to you. Another place where I often wonder why global health hasn't tapped into is YouTube. YouTube, I think, is an amazing influencer space, and I think of all the social media platforms, probably has the strongest influence on youth. And if you watch the top influencers on YouTube, if you watch their daily vlogs, you're bombarded without actually knowing it sometimes by all kinds of products and campaigns and other things. And I think that'd be a wonderful space for us to incorporate some really important global health campaigns, be it specific diseases or broader issues. I just think that those people could really raise the profile of some of the issues we work on.
Yeah, I know. I definitely agree about the YouTube. I think if you look at some of the top YouTube influencers, I think the top 20 are under 18. So it's definitely a space that we can definitely tap more into. You really bring up a good point about kind of using influencers that perhaps aren't like celebrities. I think when we chatted yesterday, you talked about like community health workers, and they are their own celebrities kind of in their own right. And we forget how powerful their networks are. And even if they're not using like Twitter or Facebook, they're certainly using another kind of social media platform that we often don't think it's social media, but WhatsApp is huge. If you think about it in the global context and kind of the networks that they have there. So they really could kind of just think outside the box in some of these places. And I know WhatsApp, I read an article on TechCrunch recently that WhatsApp has, 500 million users a day. So that's really like some spaces that we have to kind of think outside the box and tap into.
Yeah, the reach of WhatsApp is incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I would love to take some questions from the audience. I want to make sure that we can answer some of these really great questions that came in. So, Lippy, I'm going to be pulling in some that have come in this morning. So let's maybe perhaps talk a little bit about, someone had a question about building audience and building buzz around an organization. The question is, how can my organization create buzz around our area of interest? For example, chronic disease research and management. We post informational posts on each social media forum, but struggle to create conversations. What advice would you give someone who has a more kind of, I guess, less easy to talk about topic on social media? How do you kind of create buzz around something like that?
That's a really good question. So I think sometimes creating buzz on social media requires a lot of offline and occasionally scripted work. And in doing that, in orchestrating a conversation, you can sometimes create an organic buzz. Just an example from my past, and if any past colleagues are listening on the phone, I hope you're smiling as I talk about this. But at one point, I had to create a campaign around market dynamics, to simplify the economics inside global health, supply and demand for products, and how these systems work. And that was a difficult topic, and a very intellectual topic, one that's kind of hard to explain just in conversation. And we wanted to create buzz around it. There, of course, wasn't a specific World Health Day that was related to this topic, and there wasn't a hashtag or an existing community online that if they were engaged on it, we certainly weren't seeing it rise to the top of social media. So the thing that we did and a possible strategy for you is identifying the top experts in that space and using their own channels to talk about that topic, and then using our social media to elevate it. So we had each expert write up a piece. The piece was then posted on their blogs, which were then cross-posted onto the past blog, and then behind the scenes, we orchestrated a Twitter campaign where we sent out the blogs and sample tweets to a community of engaged partners, had them all tweet at the same time, and ultimately created our moment. And then we were able to leverage that moment throughout the year as needed. The moment established its hashtag, and conversations continued organically. So I think the simple answer there is, I think, taking a hard look at the leaders on the topic and then creating a moment for them by asking them in advance to participate in a online conversation that you are, for better or worse, scripting.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. There's another question about audience. Knowing that the general public is not an audience, and honestly, I don't think general public is even a thing anymore. Can you talk a little bit more about audience segmentation? Can you talk a little bit more about audience segmentation, and is there a specific audience you think really needs to be developed for making an impact?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I think it's extremely important to divide audiences. I will say this because I think I've talked a lot about, do impressions really matter, and does reach really matter? And they do. They matter a lot for growing your channels. But when it comes to targeted campaigns, I think audience segmentation is really important. And it's really important, especially when you're thinking about the quality of the participants in a campaign and the ultimate ask of the campaign. And if there's a group of people that I think we should be doing, I think we should be more focused on as the global health community overall, it's one, as you already mentioned, Corinne, health workers. I think we often talk about health workers and we put them in our human interest stories. I think we share about them almost outside of their experience, but I don't see why they can't actually be the speakers on social media. And I think that in itself would help us segment that audience and do a much better job of reaching it. Another group, I think, is young professionals in global health. If you look on Twitter, while we have our influencers definitely taking influencers or experts or C-suite leaders taking over the conversation on Twitter, you will see that young professionals, people in MPH programs, people in mechanisms like Global Health Corps and other fellowships and internships, I think they're really driving a lot of the global health social media conversation, though they're not ever, I think, directly targeted in those conversations. And that's a huge tool that we should be using. I think that they have a lot of reach, and I think that their peers are incredibly important in global health conversations.
Yeah, no, that's great. Another question that just came in is, are there other channels besides Twitter to reach high-level policymakers and health peers? I think we talked a little bit about it, about how you kind of keep up with the space broadly, and it's not always on social media. So can you share a little bit more about perhaps newsletters or other things that you kind of use to keep up and talk to other high-level people?
Yeah. I will say first and foremost, I do get most of my global health news from Twitter. But interestingly, I think one of the most up-to-date sources of information for me has been listservs and newsletters. I think news blasts from everywhere, whether it's press clippings inside USAID, the Kaiser Health News Blast, you guys at Devex, of course. I think just one, I trust and appreciate the people that are curating that information, but I just have found that our community really uses listservs and newsletters very well, and that's been a great source of information for me. And I think the other part of that question about how to target high-level policymakers outside of Twitter, I think a great way to do that is LinkedIn. LinkedIn exists so that you can talk to people according to their professional level, right? It's not just a job search tool or a job advertising tool. It's also a great way to have to make social media connections. And I think a lot of our organizations only utilize LinkedIn as a job tool, but I think it's a great place to post content. Actually, it's a really great place to explore paid advertising, though it's pretty expensive, but it's one of the few platforms that will allow you to advertise specifically to a type of professional and their level in a company. So something to look at.
Yes, absolutely. I think they definitely are expensive, but I think you're also getting really quality hits. I think perhaps that's why it's more expensive. There's a question here about, there's a question here about social media platforms and kind of the rise of false health information. Especially, I think one that we can think of is like anti-vaccine messages. Did you ever experience this in your work, and how do you kind of combat that? Do you think that kind of information should be banned?
That is a very good question, and definitely one that is really hot right now. So it's unfortunate that there is so much false information sharing on social media, and I think I know that, as many of you know, almost all the social media platforms are trying to figure out a way to combat that. I'm not sure about banning false information in the sense that I wonder how exactly a platform would do that. But what I do think is really important is that we as global health communicators and global health experts we should be very aware of how much false information is spread on social media and create campaigns that directly target that and push it down. Because as a unified force, I think we are actually much louder than, for example, in the vaccine hesitancy world, the anti-vaxxers. And I think that it's really important that while we're doing, awareness campaigns, issue salience campaigns, visibility campaigns, that we direct some of those campaigns at exactly that. And I've seen quite a few articles come out recently about this issue, and I think it's really great that influencers are now getting on board on how to make sure that accurate information is rising to the top. But yes, I encourage those people listening on the phone, especially if any of them are vaccine communicators, to think through a community-wide joint campaign strategy to really push incorrect information down.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's also a really good opportunity for these organizations to kind of create coalitions and band together around some of these topics too, and like go directly to the platforms. I think a lot of like human rights and anti-harassment campaigns did this with Twitter when like all the sexual harassment was really kind of at the peak that was happening on Twitter. So I think it would be a really kind of good opportunity to go to these organizations with solutions and kind of figure out how you can create those solutions with them as well. There's a question here about how do you reduce the generational gap in workplaces where senior executives don't trust social media as a way to help build donors, awareness, and communications? And this is an interesting question because I think definitely like 10 years ago, but I think social media has really kind of, I guess, put a mark in its place. But I think definitely there are some legacy organizations that still are a little hesitant. So how do you kind of help reduce that, or how would you kind of prove your ROI?
Such a good question, and I'm sure so many people on the phone have personal experience with creating the case for social media in their organizations, especially some of our these classic global health NGOs that have existed for a really long time, or governing bodies. I think for me personally, in my experience, the best way that I accomplished this was actually creating social media presence for those people that were critics of social media to show the value of online engagement in offline spaces. I think and you don't have to do this at a very large level right away, because I think that also can be scary. But I think in small levels, if you show that you can use social media for networking that would never be available to a person in a meeting or in person, I think that is one of the best ways to prove the value of social media. And then I also think that what we talked about earlier in this call, looking at a campaign and looking at not the reach numbers, but the quality engagement that you got from the campaign, be it from a VIP in the global health space, a politician, someone, an influencer, a change maker, and how they interacted with your content. I think that is the best way to pitch the value of social media.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to we're kind of running out of time, unfortunately, here, but I'd love to maybe end on a fun note and kind of give a shout out to what do you think are some global health topics that don't get enough love on social media? Because I know that there's some that everyone talks about and we kind of all join the awareness days for, but what are some global health topics that don't get enough love?
I love that. Okay, so one thing that I think we should really talk about more on social media is behavior change. And I think specifically how to use social media for behavior change, because that world exists and there's tons of research on it, and there are people that dedicate their careers to it. And I really think that we should be hearing more about that in global health as social media communicators. Another thing, this one is a little bit sad, but I think really important, is protecting health workers. I just saw another article go up this morning from the Washington Post about health workers being targeted in DRC, in the violence there. And this isn't a direct health issue, but it kind of is it's absolutely central to our work. And health workers need to be safe doing what they do. So I think social media should really be used to spread the word on this. And I know the WHO is trying with the Not a Target hashtag, and I hope that gets more use, and I hope that we can really raise the profile of that. And then I think the last thing is the professional development side of our work. Social media is a space to talk about the issues of our industry. So let's use it to talk about opportunities for young professionals, diversifying our leadership, bringing more women into leadership roles in our industry, talking about, being students. Are there enough opportunities for the number of students that we have in this industry? So on and so forth. I think that social media is one of the only places where we have the opportunity to have those types of conversations, and we should be doing a lot more of that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Libby. I've really, really enjoyed this, and I think our listeners have too. We've seen a ton of questions come in, but unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our scheduled time for this conference call. So we want to thank you all for joining from all over the world. And we see the questions in the box, and Libby and I will take some time to answer them via email. So don't worry, we'll definitely answer those. And once you exit the call, a survey will appear in your browser. And if you have just 2 minutes, we would really appreciate your feedback about this conference call. And if you have any ideas for future events, or any ideas for me to talk about on message on Devex, if you want to listen to this call again or share it with your colleagues, we will be emailing it to you probably next week and posting a recap on Devex.com. Thank you again so much, Libby, for joining us. It was really, really, really interesting. And you all can follow Lippy at Lippy Doshi, Doshi, on Twitter. And you can find some of her other resources that we posted in the document in the window before you guys pop out of here. So thank you guys so much, and we hope you have an awesome Friday.